Imagine being an ordinary citizen of Italy in the late 1950s. You live beside the Adriatic Sea. You go to work every morning, drink coffee in the afternoon, and spend your evenings with friends and family. Then, one day, someone you trust introduces you to a remarkably unusual person. They are calm, intelligent, and strangely familiar. And after several meetings, they quietly reveal an impossible truth. They are not human. They have been living among humanity for a very long time, and they would like your help. There will be no reward, no recognition, and no explanation you could ever share publicly. If you agree, you must keep their existence secret for the rest of your life. According to hundreds of Italians, this is exactly what happened. For more than 20 years, they claim to have participated in a hidden organization known simply as friendship. A secret relationship between humanity and a civilization that was already here. By the time this story would eventually become public, nearly 50 years had already passed. This is one of the reasons the friendship case has remained so difficult to classify. There was no dramatic press conference in the 1960s. There were no journalists racing through Italian streets with cameras. There was no sudden declaration that extraterrestrials had arrived. Instead, dozens of people quietly carried the same secret for decades and only began speaking openly about it when many of them were already elderly. According to the witnesses, this was intentional from the very beginning. Whatever friendship was, it was never designed to become a movement. It was designed to remain invisible. The story begins in 1956 in the Adriatic city of Pescara with a man named Bruno Sammachitia. At the time, Bruno was not a UFO investigator or an author. He was simply a well-connected citizen with a large social circle who lived an ordinary Italian life. He had friends throughout central Italy, enjoyed conversation, and, by all accounts, was neither gullible nor obsessed with extraterrestrials. If anything, his future role in the story makes very little sense. There was nothing exceptional about him on paper. He did not possess scientific credentials. He was not a military officer. He was not a politician. Yet, according to later testimony, someone had decided he was exactly the sort of person they were looking for. Bruno would eventually come to believe that he had not discovered friendship at all. Friendship had discovered him. The first stage was subtle. People began appearing in his life who seemed unusual in ways that were difficult to explain. They were intelligent without being arrogant. They spoke calmly and deliberately. They never dominated conversations, yet somehow became the focal point of every room they entered. They knew an extraordinary amount about history, philosophy, politics, and human behavior. They asked unusual questions that were neither scientific nor religious, but something in between. Instead of asking, "What do you do for work?" they might ask, "What do you believe humanity will become in 100 years? Instead of discussing money, they wanted to discuss morality. Instead of asking where someone had traveled, they asked where civilization itself was heading. Then came the invitations. According to multiple accounts, nobody received a formal invitation. Nobody opened an envelope. Nobody received coded messages. Friendship expanded entirely through trust. Someone Bruno already respected would quietly say there was another person he should meet. That person would then introduce him to another. Every meeting felt almost accidental, yet after enough of them, Bruno began to realize there was a pattern. These people already knew each other. They were connected by something invisible. The locations themselves were strangely ordinary. Meetings took place in cafes, homes, offices, and restaurants throughout Pescara and neighbouring communities. Nothing dramatic ever occurred. Nobody wore uniforms. Nobody presented secret documents. Yet Bruno later claimed that every encounter felt deliberate, as though he was being observed and evaluated without his knowledge. The people he met never pressured him. They simply watched how he behaved. They observed whether he was discreet, whether he gossiped, whether he exaggerated stories, whether he treated strangers respectfully, and whether he could be trusted with small responsibilities. The first responsibilities were almost laughably mundane. Bruno might be asked to accompany someone on a drive into the countryside. He might be asked to deliver a package without opening it. He might be asked to attend a meeting without discussing it with anyone afterward. None of the tasks seemed important by themselves, but together they created the impression that he was being slowly initiated into something much larger than he could understand. Then came one of the earliest journeys that would later become famous among friendship believers. Bruno and two associates, usually identified as Giancarlo and Giulio, travelled inland toward the area surrounding Rocca Pia, near Ascoli Piceno. The drive itself would have taken them away from the familiarity of the Adriatic coast and into older Italy, where medieval stone fortresses and mountain roads still dominated the landscape. They arrived at a location that was isolated but not inaccessible, a place chosen precisely because it attracted no attention. According to their later recollections, there they encountered two individuals unlike anyone they had ever met. The witnesses described both figures as unmistakably unusual without appearing monstrous. One was extremely tall, perhaps over 7 feet according to some accounts, while the other was much shorter. Neither individual displayed any sense of urgency or theatricality. They did not attempt to impress their visitors. They did not emerge from a spacecraft. They simply spoke. The conversation itself would become one of the most unusual aspects of the entire friendship story, because the revelation was delivered so casually. The beings explained that they were not human, and that they had been operating on Earth for a very long time. According to the witnesses, they behaved as though this fact should not have been surprising. Bruno later described the experience as profoundly disorienting, because nothing matched his expectations. He had not encountered conquerors. He had not encountered scientists conducting experiments. He had encountered polite, composed individuals who spoke about humanity with a curious mixture of affection and disappointment. They explained that they had chosen certain humans because they needed assistance operating discreetly within human society. They could not reveal themselves publicly because humanity was not ready, and any sudden disclosure would create fear, chaos, and exploitation. Then they presented the conditions that would define the next 20 years of Bruno's life. If he agreed to participate, he could never seek fame. He could never accept money. He could never use the information to elevate himself above others. He could never discuss the relationship carelessly. there would be no reward except knowledge itself. Bruno later said that this was one of the reasons he believed them. There was absolutely nothing to gain. In fact, participating only made life more complicated. Over the next several years, this hidden network would quietly expand throughout Italy. New individuals would be introduced one at a time. A businessman from Rome, an engineer from another city, professionals, artists, and educated citizens who could move through society without attracting attention. Nobody was chosen because of status. They were chosen because of temperament. The extraterrestrials, according to the witnesses, had spent years learning which humans could remain silent. That detail may be the strangest aspect of all. According to Friendship, Earth was not being invaded. It was being observed. Somewhere beneath the ordinary rhythm of post-war Italy, a second society already existed. While fishermen returned to Pescara each morning, and families gathered for dinner every evening, another network was quietly growing in the background. It had no headquarters, no public face, and no official name. It existed entirely through relationships, and every single person who entered it carried the same impossible understanding: humanity was not alone. And for reasons nobody yet understood, central Italy had become one of the places where that secret was finally being shared. If the first years of Friendship were about trust, the next years were about revelation. The humans who had accepted the strange invitations soon discovered that they were no longer simply meeting unusual people. They were being introduced to an entirely different civilization that, according to the witnesses, had already been living quietly among humanity for a very long time. At some point during the late 1950s and early 1960s, the central participants, including Bruno Sammachitia and his growing circle of associates, were formally introduced to the beings themselves. The extraterrestrials would eventually become known as the W56, a name that participants later associated with the year 1956. When the first contacts began, the witnesses never described this as an official organization with membership cards or ranks. Friendship was simply what everyone called it, because that was the nature of the relationship. The extraterrestrials referred to the humans as collaborators, companions, and friends. The first thing that struck almost every witness was how profoundly ordinary the W56 appeared. This was not a world of enormous black eyes, metallic jumpsuits, and frightening examinations. The beings looked so human that many participants claimed they could have walked through the streets of Rome or Pescara without anyone noticing them at all. They were frequently described as exceptionally tall, often somewhere between 6 and 7 feet, though not every witness agreed on exact height. Their bodies were athletic but lean. Their movements were precise and graceful, almost as if every gesture had been carefully considered beforehand. Their faces were symmetrical to an unusual degree. Their skin appeared healthy and smooth. Their eyes were bright and alert without being piercing or intimidating. Several participants would later say they carried themselves with a kind of serenity that ordinary humans rarely possess. The clothing was equally surprising. The W56 allegedly wore sweaters, pressed trousers, collared shirts, simple jackets, and polished shoes. Nothing looked futuristic. Nothing looked theatrical. Some occasionally wore dark sunglasses, even indoors. Others dressed so conservatively they could have been mistaken for professors, engineers, or businessmen. According to the witnesses, this was intentional. The W56 had learned how to blend into human society and preferred to attract as little attention as possible. Their speech was equally unusual. They spoke excellent Italian, but sometimes with subtle oddities that were difficult to identify. Witnesses said their voices were soft, measured, and almost musical. They never interrupted. They never raised their voices. They rarely used contractions or slang, and often chose words with extraordinary precision. One participant later remarked that conversations with them felt as though every sentence had already been carefully constructed before it was spoken. The locations of these meetings were often hidden from public view. Participants described being brought to villas, remote properties, and secluded areas throughout central Italy. Some meetings occurred during daylight hours, while others took place late at night. Nobody was blindfolded, but routes were deliberately confusing. A participant might drive for an hour towards the mountains, then be instructed to follow another vehicle down a road they had never noticed before. Every precaution was designed to protect secrecy. Then the W56 began explaining the rules. The first rule was absolute discretion. The humans were forbidden from discussing the relationship publicly. They could not tell journalists. They could not write books. They could not reveal locations. They could only share information with individuals specifically approved by the group. The second rule was perhaps stranger. No one could profit from friendship. Participants could not ask for money, gifts, status, or favors. Any person motivated by greed would immediately be excluded. The W56 supposedly believed that human ambition was one of the greatest threats to civilization and refused to reward it. The third rule involved trust. The humans would be asked to perform tasks without always understanding their purpose. They might deliver an object. They might escort a person. They might transport equipment. They would be expected to complete these tasks without asking unnecessary questions. Then came the revelations about humanity itself. According to the witnesses, the W56 explained that human civilization was still immature. They said technological advancement was occurring faster than moral development, and that this imbalance posed a serious danger. Humanity had become capable of creating tremendous power without developing the wisdom necessary to use it responsibly. Nuclear weapons were frequently mentioned as evidence that humans had become dangerous to themselves. The W56 also made another extraordinary claim. They were not visitors. Earth was not an expedition. It was an assignment. The witnesses said the W56 explained that they had been operating here for a very long time, quietly studying humanity and attempting to guide events away from catastrophe whenever possible. They described themselves not as rulers, but as custodians. They would occasionally intervene when absolutely necessary, but preferred that humans solve their own problems. Then the story became even stranger. the W-56 allegedly revealed that they were not alone. There were other extraterrestrial groups already operating around Earth, and they did not all share the same goals. Some civilizations were benevolent, others were indifferent. Some were actively manipulative and sought influence over humanity for their own purposes. The W-56 described Earth as a place of tremendous importance, almost like a crossroads where multiple civilizations maintained an interest. The human participants were stunned. Many later described the moment as the true beginning of friendship, because it shattered their understanding of reality. They had entered believing they were meeting a hidden group of extraterrestrials. Instead, they were being told that Earth itself was part of a much larger network of civilizations, and that humanity occupied only a small corner of an unimaginably vast community. Yet even after revealing all of this, the W-56 remained remarkably ordinary in their behavior. They drank coffee, they smiled at jokes, they discussed philosophy, they asked participants about their families and their work. Witnesses repeatedly said the greatest shock was not their appearance, but their kindness. There was no sense of superiority. There was no attempt to dominate the humans around them. The W-56 seemed genuinely interested in understanding humanity, while simultaneously worrying about its future. Years later, several participants would say that this was what made the entire experience so difficult to explain. If the W-56 had behaved like monsters, everyone would have run away. If they had behaved like gods, everyone would have worshipped them. Instead, they behaved like neighbours. Exceptionally intelligent, impossibly calm neighbours who quietly insisted that humanity was not alone, and who, from hidden places scattered throughout Italy, had been waiting patiently for trustworthy humans to help them with a mission that was far larger than anyone yet understood. And soon, those humans would discover exactly why they had been chosen. Because beneath Italy itself, according to the witnesses, there were places that should not have existed at all. By the mid-1960s, many of the human participants no longer believed they were simply assisting a hidden group living quietly in Italy. According to their testimony, they had gradually come to understand something much larger and far more unsettling. The W-56 were not temporary visitors. They were part of an enormous infrastructure already operating beneath human civilization, and for years they had carefully concealed its existence from everyone except a small circle of trusted collaborators. The first clues emerged through the deliveries. Participants would receive requests that initially seemed trivial. A vehicle would need to be driven from one city to another. Boxes would need to be transported. Equipment would need to be moved at unusual hours. The objects themselves often appeared completely ordinary. Some were metal containers, others were sealed crates with no markings whatsoever. Participants were explicitly instructed not to open them. They were not given explanations, and, according to many accounts, the humans gradually learned not to ask for them. The journeys themselves were often peculiar. Participants described driving into remote parts of Italy, particularly mountainous regions where roads narrowed and traffic disappeared. The W56 always seemed to know routes that ordinary people did not. Cars would leave major highways and travel on to forgotten roads that eventually ended near cliffsides, abandoned properties, or heavily forested areas where nothing appeared to exist. Then something impossible would happen. A door would appear where there had been no door. Several witnesses described sections of rock that seemed solid until the extraterrestrials approached them. Openings would become visible, and vehicles could pass through entrances hidden directly within mountainsides. According to the participants, these were not caves in the ordinary sense. They were enormous installations concealed beneath Italy itself. One of the locations repeatedly mentioned by participants was said to be hidden beneath Mount Gran Sasso, the enormous mountain massif that dominates central Abruzzo. Another was allegedly located beneath Mount Maiella. Others were said to exist throughout Italy, connected to one another in ways the humans never fully understood. The W56 never treated these facilities as extraordinary. They behaved as though this hidden infrastructure was perfectly normal and had existed for a very long time. The humans who entered these places described scenes that bordered on surreal. Vast chambers stretched beyond what seemed physically possible. The air was cool and dry. There was no dust. The walls were smooth and sometimes emitted a faint glow without visible lamps. Participants repeatedly remarked that there was almost no noise. Machinery existed, but it was silent. Devices operated, but without vibration. Everything appeared astonishingly clean. One of the strangest details involved food. Witnesses claimed the W56 maintained enormous refrigerated storage rooms unlike anything they had ever seen. Some described gigantic chambers filled with fruits, vegetables, and provisions. Others spoke of towering refrigeration units that seemed capable of preserving vast quantities of food for indefinite periods. The extraterrestrials explained that these supplies were not merely for themselves. They were emergency reserves intended to help humanity during future crises if necessary. Then there were the crystals. Several participants later spoke about unusual orange or amber-coloured crystalline materials used by the W56. The humans never fully understood their purpose, but they believed these substances were related to energy production. The extraterrestrials allegedly possessed technologies that produced almost no waste and required very little maintenance. Participants were occasionally allowed to observe these systems, but were discouraged from touching anything unless instructed to do so. The W56 also maintained what witnesses described as manufacturing facilities. According to some accounts, humans watched objects being assembled without traditional tools or factories. Components appeared to fit together with impossible precision. Devices had no visible wires. Lights illuminated without bulbs. Doors opened without hinges. The extraterrestrials never attempted to explain every mechanism because, according to them, humanity lacks the scientific framework to understand what it was seeing. Yet none of this was the most astonishing revelation. The most astonishing revelation was the map. At some point during their involvement, participants said the W56 explained that Earth was already known throughout a much larger community of civilizations. The humans had assumed they were dealing with a singular extraterrestrial species. The W-56 corrected them immediately. There were many. Earth was not isolated. Earth was observed. According to the witnesses, some civilizations had maintained an interest in humanity for thousands of years. Others had arrived more recently. Some were benevolent. Others were opportunistic. A few were considered dangerous. The W-56 allegedly spoke of these groups with the matter-of-factness of neighbouring nations rather than fantastical monsters. The humans were told that civilizations frequently disagreed about how Earth should be approached. Some believed humanity should be left completely alone. Others favoured limited contact. A few wished to manipulate events from behind the scenes for their own benefit. The W-56 claimed they belonged to a coalition that preferred patience, believing humanity needed to evolve naturally rather than be controlled. This explanation suddenly transformed everything the participants thought they understood about history. Strange religious stories, ancient myths, legends of visitors descending from the sky. The W-56 suggested these were not entirely fictional. They implied that human beings had encountered non-human intelligences many times throughout history, but had interpreted them through the language available at the time. Ancient people called them gods. Medieval people called them celestial visitors. Modern people called them extraterrestrials. According to the W-56, humans had simply changed the vocabulary while describing the same phenomenon. As their confidence in the human collaborators grew, the extraterrestrials revealed one final truth that profoundly unsettled many of them. Earth was strategically important. Participants never fully understood why. Some believed humanity itself possessed unusual potential. Others believed the planet occupied an important position geographically within larger interstellar networks. The W-56 never provided a complete answer, only emphasizing that Earth mattered far more than humans realized. That importance explained why so many civilizations maintained a presence here. It also explained why secrecy was absolutely necessary. Humanity was not ready to learn it was already sharing its world. The extraterrestrials feared that governments would militarize the information, corporations would exploit it, and ambitious individuals would attempt to seize control of technologies they did not understand. In their view, the greatest threat to Earth was not hostile extraterrestrials, but humanity's own immaturity. For years, the human participants quietly carried these revelations, while returning home each night to ordinary lives. They went to work. They paid taxes. They attended weddings and funerals. Yet hidden beneath the routines of daily existence was an extraordinary realization that never left them. While millions of Italians slept peacefully each night, enormous silent installations allegedly operated beneath their mountains, stocked with supplies, powered by unknown technologies, and inhabited by beings who insisted they were merely one civilization among many already living alongside humanity. And according to the witnesses, that was never supposed to become public knowledge at all. If the friendship story ended with Bruno Sammaticcia, it would probably have disappeared forever. One man claiming to know extraterrestrials is easy to dismiss. What makes friendship unusual is that Bruno was never alone. As the decades passed, a small number of participants slowly emerged from the shadows, many of them already elderly, and each one described the same burden. They had spent years carrying an impossible secret, while simultaneously trying to live ordinary lives. One of those people was Stefano Breccia, an Italian engineer and university professor. Unlike Bruno, Stefano belonged to a slightly younger generation of participants. He was not present for the earliest meetings of 1956, but he eventually became one of the most important custodians of the story, because he spent years interviewing those who were. Rather than behaving like a sensationalist, Breccia approached friendship almost like an archivist. He collected memories, photographs, technical sketches, conversations, and testimonies from aging participants who feared their experiences would vanish when they died. Then there was Alfredo Benni, who later appeared in documentaries discussing the case. Benni did not describe a life of adventure. Instead, he described something stranger: normality. That word appears repeatedly throughout friendship testimony. Participants would describe spending an evening discussing extraterrestrial civilizations, then returning home to prepare for work the next morning. There was no applause, no audience. They were expected to simply continue being ordinary citizens. Another name that appears is Mirella Bergamini, who also later came forward publicly. Like several others, she described the tremendous weight of remaining silent for decades. The participants often said secrecy became easier with time because they discovered very quickly that telling anyone would sound absurd. How do you explain to your family that you spent an evening with beings who claimed to be from another civilization, then returned home in time for dinner? Eventually, many participants stopped trying. They simply divided their lives into two worlds: the life everyone could see, and the life they never discussed. One anecdote from Bruno himself perfectly illustrates how bizarre friendship became. According to his accounts, he and others would sometimes be asked to organize deliveries of fruits, water, and other provisions. Trucks would arrive at predetermined locations, sometimes in isolated areas. Then the humans would be instructed to leave temporarily. When they returned, entire loads had vanished. Bruno insisted this happened repeatedly over many years. 2 truckloads a month, he claimed, could disappear into hidden installations without leaving obvious traces. Another memory that fascinated Stefano Breccia involved simple walks. Bruno allegedly told him that he would sometimes walk along the Adriatic coast with members of the W-56. Imagine that image for a moment. There was no ceremony, no security detail, just 2 figures walking beside the sea, discussing humanity's future while waves crashed against the shore. Bruno later said the extraterrestrials seemed deeply interested in human emotions because they believed emotions would ultimately determine humanity's fate more than technology ever could. Perhaps the most interesting human participant outside Bruno was Alberto Perego, an Italian diplomat and aristocrat who reportedly became involved through the Friendship Network. Perrigo was already interested in UFO phenomena before Friendship became public knowledge, which made his involvement particularly intriguing to later researchers. According to documentary participants, his status gave him access to circles that ordinary citizens did not possess, further reinforcing the idea that the network quietly extended into many layers of Italian society. Then something unexpected happened. Time itself became the enemy. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, many of the original participants were elderly. Some were already dead. Others worried that the entire story would disappear forever. They had obeyed the rules for decades, but they began asking themselves a difficult question. If nobody spoke now, what had been the purpose of carrying the secret at all? According to those who eventually came forward, circumstances had changed. Humanity had entered the internet age. Information could spread globally in minutes. People were becoming more open to discussing unusual ideas. Most importantly, many of the participants believed they had already honored their promise. 40 or 50 years had passed. The world was different now. Bruno Sammarchicha himself died in 2003. Before his death, he entrusted much of his story to Stefano Breccia, who published books and shared the testimony with the wider world. That act fundamentally transformed Friendship from a hidden Italian secret into an international mystery. What I find most compelling, however, is not the extraterrestrials. It is the old men. Imagine sitting in an apartment in Pescara in your 70s or 80s. Your grandchildren are playing in another room. The television is on. Italy has changed beyond recognition since your youth. The world has entered the 21st century. And all the while, you have carried the same memory since 1956. You remember a drive into the mountains. You remember impossible conversations. You remember hidden places. You remember beings who insisted humanity was not alone. You remember promises you made as a young man. Then one day, after half a century of silence, you decide to speak. Not because you want attention, not because you want money, but because you have reached an age where dying with the secret feels stranger than telling it. That may be the most mysterious aspect of Friendship. The story was never hidden by governments. It was hidden by ordinary Italians. For almost 50 years, hundreds of people allegedly lived with an impossible understanding of reality, then quietly went to work every morning and never mentioned it to anyone. And according to them, somewhere beneath Italy, the friends they had once known were still there, waiting patiently for humanity to grow up. The longer participants remained involved with Friendship, the more unusual their relationship with the W56 became. Many of them would later say that the greatest shock was not discovering extraterrestrials existed, but discovering how quickly extraordinary things became ordinary. Human beings have an incredible ability to adapt, and according to the witnesses, after years of involvement, They stopped behaving as though they were meeting alien visitors altogether. The W-56 simply became another part of life. A participant might leave work in Pescara, drive into the countryside, spend 3 hours discussing humanity's future with extraterrestrials, and then return home in time for dinner. Over the course of 20 years, this routine allegedly happened hundreds of times. Bruno Sammarchicha later described the W-56 as possessing an unusual combination of warmth and distance. They were affectionate toward humans, but never emotional in the way people expected. They would smile, joke, and ask questions about participants' families, but they remained profoundly reserved when discussing themselves. The humans slowly realized that the extraterrestrials had no interest in being worshipped. In fact, the W-56 actively discouraged admiration. Whenever participants began treating them as superior beings, they would redirect the conversation back toward humanity itself. They insisted that humans were perfectly capable of achieving extraordinary things, but had become distracted by greed, competition, and short-term thinking. According to several participants, the extraterrestrials enjoyed long conversations more than anything else. Entire evenings would be spent discussing philosophy, history, and the future of civilization. The W-56 were reportedly fascinated by human contradictions. They admired art, but were puzzled by war. They admired compassion, but could not understand cruelty. They repeatedly returned to one subject above all others: why humans were so eager to divide themselves. National borders, political ideologies, economic classes, and religious conflicts seemed bizarre to them. One witness recalled being asked, "Why does humanity spend so much energy separating itself from itself?" The question reportedly lingered with him for decades. The participants also noticed unusual habits that gradually became impossible to ignore. The W-56 rarely seemed to sleep. Meetings could continue well into the early hours of the morning, without any sign of fatigue. They consumed food, but not in large quantities. Several witnesses later described them eating fruit almost ceremonially, slicing pieces slowly, and consuming only a small amount before continuing their discussions. Water appeared to be more important to them than food. Participants repeatedly recalled crystal clear pitchers of water always being present during gatherings. The extraterrestrials also displayed an extraordinary memory. Bruno later claimed that individuals he had met years earlier would remember every detail of previous conversations. They could recall names, dates, locations, and personal anecdotes with astonishing precision. One participant reportedly mentioned an offhand remark about his mother's health during an early meeting, only to have a member of the W-56 ask about her condition years later. This was deeply unsettling to many of the humans because it suggested that the extraterrestrials were paying attention to everything. Transportation itself became one of the enduring mysteries. Participants described occasions when they were instructed to drive to seemingly random locations outside Pescara, Rome, or smaller towns in Abruzzo. They would arrive at predetermined times and simply wait. Eventually, a vehicle would appear carrying one or more members of the W-56. No one ever seemed to know where these individuals had come from. They would simply materialize within the network, participate in meetings, and then vanished back into ordinary Italian life. Some witnesses later said that this was when they began to suspect the extraterrestrials were far more numerous than they had originally believed. In the early years, participants imagined they were dealing with a small group of perhaps a dozen individuals. Over time, that estimate expanded dramatically. New faces appeared constantly. Some participants believed there were hundreds of W-56 operating throughout Europe. Others believed there were thousands spread across the planet. Nobody seemed entirely certain because the extraterrestrials never answered direct questions about their population. The W-56 also possessed a remarkable ability to avoid attention. Participants repeatedly described situations that, in retrospect, seemed impossible. They would leave a crowded area together, only for the extraterrestrials to somehow disappear moments later. Several witnesses said this was not because they physically vanished, but because they seemed to understand human behavior so completely that they always knew where people would and would not be looking. One participant jokes that the W-56 could hide in plain sight because they understood humanity better than humans understood themselves. As trust grew, the extraterrestrials became slightly more forthcoming about the scale of their operations. Participants began hearing references to facilities that existed beyond their normal meeting places. Conversations would occasionally drift toward storage locations, supply centers, and protected areas scattered throughout Italy. The W-56 never described them as bases in the military sense. Instead, they spoke about them almost like pieces of infrastructure quietly supporting a larger mission. The humans slowly realized that these places were essential to everything Friendship was doing. Supplies were moved there, equipment was stored there, new arrivals sometimes emerged from there. Yet almost no participant was granted unrestricted access. Even trusted collaborators only saw small portions of these hidden environments. One witness later said that Friendship operated like a vast underground tree. The humans could see individual branches, but never the entire organism. Certain clues began accumulating over the years. Participants heard references to enormous rooms hidden beneath mountains. Others described hearing about storage facilities large enough to sustain thousands of people. Some recalled seeing corridors carved into solid rock that extended farther than they could physically walk. The extraterrestrials never boasted about these places. If anything, they seemed reluctant to discuss them, as though revealing too much would violate some larger agreement. One recurring subject that deeply unsettled the participants was the idea of contingency planning. The W-56 apparently believed humanity was entering a dangerous period. Nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, and social instability were all discussed frequently. The extraterrestrials spoke as though they had already prepared for multiple possible futures. Supplies had been gathered, safe locations had been established. Entire systems had been quietly maintained for decades. The humans were never told every detail, but they were given enough information to understand that these preparations were enormous in scale. As the years passed, some participants began wondering whether Friendship itself had ever truly been about contact at all. Increasingly, It felt as though they had been recruited into a support network that had existed long before they arrived and would continue long after they were gone. Their job was not to reveal extraterrestrials to humanity. Their job was to assist in maintaining something hidden. And according to the witnesses, hidden is exactly what it was. Because beneath the mountains of Italy, beyond the visible roads, and beneath landscapes millions of people drove past every year without a second thought, there were allegedly installations so vast, so meticulously constructed, and so thoroughly concealed that some participants began to suspect humanity had been sharing its world with another civilization for far longer than anyone could possibly imagine. Participants involved with friendship began to realize that the extraterrestrials were not improvising their existence on Earth. They had not recently arrived, nor were they hiding inside a handful of secret rooms scattered around Italy. According to the witnesses, the W-56 possessed an immense hidden infrastructure that had been operating quietly for decades and perhaps much longer. What began as rumours of isolated meeting places gradually evolved into something far more extraordinary. The humans came to believe they were assisting a civilization that already possessed its own transportation networks, storage facilities, laboratories, living quarters, and emergency shelters buried beneath parts of Italy itself. One of the locations repeatedly mentioned throughout the friendship accounts was Gran Sasso, the massive mountain range that dominates central Abruzzo. Even today, Gran Sasso is an imposing place. Jagged limestone peaks rise above forests and villages, and tunnels already exist there as part of modern infrastructure. According to the participants, this made it an ideal location for concealment, because nobody would ever suspect that another world might exist deeper inside the mountain. The extraterrestrials allegedly maintained enormous installations beneath sections of Gran Sasso that could only be accessed through hidden entrances disguised as ordinary rock formations. Witnesses claimed that entire walls could retract silently, revealing corridors where moments earlier there had appeared to be nothing at all. Participants who entered these spaces described environments unlike any human military bunker. There were no exposed pipes, concrete walls, or industrial smells. Instead, the rooms were smooth, spotless, and strangely elegant. Light appeared to emanate directly from ceilings and walls without any visible bulbs or fixtures. Temperatures remained perfectly comfortable regardless of the season outside. The air itself felt unusual. Several witnesses described it as exceptionally clean and slightly sweeter than normal air, almost as if it had been purified. The corridors themselves were said to be immense. Participants described passageways extending hundreds of meters into the mountain before branching into dozens of additional chambers. One witness later compared the experience to discovering an underground city hidden beneath Italy. The extraterrestrials never rushed anyone through these spaces. They moved slowly and calmly, as though there was no danger of being discovered. Then the humans encountered the storage facilities. These became one of the most persistent and fascinating details in friendship testimony. According to Bruno Samiciccia, there were enormous rooms dedicated entirely to food preservation. Participants described gigantic refrigeration chambers larger than many supermarkets, Shelves extended for astonishing distances, containing fruits, vegetables, grains, and other provisions carefully organized in immaculate rows. The humans were allegedly told these supplies existed for emergency situations. If humanity ever experienced catastrophe, these reserves could be distributed quickly. Participants repeatedly asked how long the food would last. According to some accounts, the extraterrestrials answered that certain preservation methods could maintain freshness for years without spoilage. The humans never fully understood how this was accomplished because there were no obvious compressors, fans, or traditional refrigeration systems. Then came the water. Several witnesses claimed there were enormous reservoirs hidden beneath the mountains. Crystal clear water flowed through channels that fed multiple facilities. The W-56 treated water almost reverentially. They frequently reminded participants that humanity was careless with its most valuable resource, and predicted that future conflicts on Earth would revolve around access to clean water rather than oil. Beyond the storage chambers were areas that participants described as workshops. These rooms reportedly contained work tables, unfamiliar devices, and objects under construction. Witnesses never described the extraterrestrials as engineers in the traditional sense. They did not weld metal or assemble machines with tools. Instead, objects seemed to be manufactured through processes the humans could not comprehend. Components fit together seamlessly without screws or visible joints. Materials appeared lighter than expected, yet stronger than steel. Some devices had smooth surfaces without buttons or controls whatsoever. The orange crystals began appearing here. Several participants later described translucent, amber-colored crystals stored inside containers or integrated into various systems. They never fully understood their purpose, but suspected they were involved in energy generation. The extraterrestrials reportedly handled them carefully and explained that humanity had not yet discovered the underlying principles required to use such materials safely. Then there were the rooms that participants simply referred to as archives. According to several accounts, these spaces contained vast quantities of information. Not books in the traditional sense, but records preserved in formats the humans could not understand. Some witnesses described translucent sheets containing moving images. Others described illuminated surfaces that responded to touch. The extraterrestrials allegedly maintained records concerning human civilization stretching back thousands of years. They spoke as though they had observed humanity for an extraordinarily long period and considered historical preservation one of their primary responsibilities. One particularly strange claim involved maps. Participants said the W-56 possessed maps that did not merely depict Earth, but showed relationships between Earth and other inhabited locations. These were not star charts in the traditional sense. Witnesses struggled to describe them because they appeared three-dimensional and dynamic, changing as information was displayed. The extraterrestrials reportedly used these maps to explain that Earth was not isolated, but occupied an important position within a much larger network of civilizations. Then there were the living quarters. Participants expected futuristic sleeping pods or sterile dormitories. Instead, they described spaces that were surprisingly comfortable. Chairs, tables, and gathering rooms were common. Some areas even contained decorative elements. According to the humans, the W56 valued beauty. They believed harmonious environments improved mental well-being. Several witnesses later remarked that the extraterrestrials seemed incapable of creating ugly spaces. Every room felt intentional. Nothing was cluttered. Nothing was excessive. Perhaps the most extraordinary claim of all involved scale. Over time, some participants came to believe they had only seen a tiny fraction of the installations. They were told that multiple complexes existed beneath Italy, including locations associated with Gran Sasso, Maiella, and other mountainous regions that were never publicly identified. These sites were allegedly connected through hidden transportation systems. The humans were not shown these networks directly, but several were told that one could travel enormous distances underground without ever emerging to the surface. The extraterrestrials also spoke about contingency shelters. According to the participants, entire sections of these facilities had been designed to accommodate humans if Earth experienced a severe crisis. Some witnesses believed thousands of people could potentially be housed there. Others believed the capacity was far greater. The extraterrestrials never elaborated because they insisted such measures would only be used as a last resort. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all was how ordinary the W56 considered these places. They never spoke about them with pride or excitement. To them, this hidden world was simply infrastructure. It was no more remarkable than a human discussing roads, reservoirs, or warehouses. The extraordinary nature of the installations existed entirely in the minds of the humans who were seeing them for the first time. By the end of their involvement, many participants no longer believed they were helping a small group of extraterrestrials hiding in Italy. They believed they had stumbled upon an ancient, patient civilization, quietly maintaining an entire parallel existence beneath human society. And if the witnesses are to be believed, millions of Italians spent decades driving past mountains, villages, and ancient roads without ever realizing that beneath their feet there allegedly existed another world entirely, one stocked with supplies, illuminated by impossible technologies, and inhabited by beings who had no intention of conquering humanity at all. They were simply waiting for humanity to become wise enough to join them. Nobody involved with friendship could ever point to a single day when it ended. There was no final meeting in a grand chamber beneath a mountain. There was no announcement that the mission was complete. There was no goodbye ceremony, no departing spacecraft, and no dramatic closing of hidden doors. One of the oddest aspects of the entire story is that after 20 years of extraordinary activity, friendship simply began to dissolve in the same quiet manner in which it had appeared. By the early 1970s, several participants noticed subtle changes. The W56 were still present, but their behavior was evolving. Meetings became less frequent. Requests for assistance grew less common. Entire months would pass without contact, whereas in previous years, participants might have met multiple times in a single week. Our atmosphere itself had changed. The humans later described a growing sense of urgency that had never existed during the early years. The extraterrestrials still smiled and conversed normally, but their discussions increasingly focused on the future. They were worried. According to the participants, the W-56 had always been patient observers of humanity, but something about the direction civilization was taking deeply concerned them. Their conversations returned repeatedly to the same subjects. They spoke about consumption, about humanity's endless appetite for acquiring more while understanding less. They spoke about pollution long before environmental collapse became a common topic of conversation. They worried about the speed at which technology was developing and repeatedly emphasized that human wisdom was not advancing at the same pace. According to several participants, the extraterrestrials believed humanity was approaching a crossroads that would define the next several centuries. One participant later recalled a particularly unsettling exchange. During a discussion about human progress, a member of the W-56 allegedly remarked that humans were becoming more connected technologically while simultaneously becoming more isolated emotionally. The participant initially dismissed the comment because it seemed absurd. This was the early 1970s. There was no internet, no smartphones, and no social media. Yet the extraterrestrial allegedly insisted that one day billions of people would possess instantaneous communication and still feel profoundly alone. Another recurring subject was information itself. The W-56 reportedly warned that humanity would eventually enter an age where truth would become difficult to recognize because the volume of information would become overwhelming. Participants said the extraterrestrials never feared ignorance. They feared confusion. They believed future humans would drown beneath competing versions of reality and would struggle to distinguish knowledge from manipulation. Several people who later retold these conversations admitted they found those warnings far more disturbing in retrospect than they did at the time. At the same time, participants noticed practical changes occurring within friendship itself. Locations that had once been active suddenly became inaccessible. Individuals who had been regular fixtures within the network quietly disappeared. Certain routes into the countryside were no longer used. Meetings that had once involved several extraterrestrials were now attended by only one or two. No explanation was immediately offered. Eventually, some of the humans asked directly what was happening. The answer was simple. According to the witnesses, the W-56 explained that their role had always been temporary. This was perhaps the most profound philosophical difference between the extraterrestrials and humanity. The humans had slowly come to rely on their presence. They trusted them. They admired them. In some cases, they had known these beings for nearly 2 decades. The W-56 understood this and gently reminded them that dependency was dangerous. Humanity could not be guided forever. If extraterrestrials remained permanently involved in human affairs, humans would stop solving their own problems. The participants reportedly protested. They argued that humanity was not ready. They pointed to wars, corruption, and instability. They insisted that civilization still needed help. The extraterrestrials disagreed. According to multiple testimonies, the W-56 believed that struggle was necessary. Civilizations matured through mistakes. They matured through consequences. If humanity was continually rescued from itself, it would never grow beyond its current limitations. Then came one of the strangest revelations of all. The W-56 allegedly explained that they had never intended to transform Earth. Their objective had simply been to establish relationships, preserve certain forms of knowledge, and identify trustworthy humans who could serve as bridges between civilizations if the need ever arose in the future. In other words, friendship itself may have been the mission all along. Some participants later described an overwhelming sadness settling over the group. For nearly 20 years, these extraordinary relationships had become normal. Men who had once trembled with disbelief now found themselves mourning the prospect of losing companions who had become part of their lives. There is something uniquely human about that. It did not matter that the W-56 claimed to come from another civilization. They had become friends. Then the disappearances accelerated. Participants described entire branches of the network becoming inactive. Phone calls ceased. Familiar faces no longer appeared. Some humans attempted to revisit locations they had traveled to countless times before, only to discover nothing there. Roads seemed unchanged, but entrances could no longer be found. Places that had once contained activity felt abandoned. Whether this was because installations had been dismantled, concealed, or never existed at all remained impossible to determine. By the late 1970s, friendship had become a shadow of what it once was. The humans grew older, families expanded, careers advanced. Italy itself transformed. The country entered a new era, while the secret world that had existed beneath it gradually receded into memory. Yet the participants never entirely let go. They still remembered names. They still remembered conversations. They still remembered impossible places that no longer seemed reachable. Then something unexpected happened. Nothing. Years passed, then more years. The 1980s arrived, the Cold War continued, technology advanced, personal computers appeared, humanity entered an entirely different world, yet no great extraterrestrial revelation occurred. No hidden civilization announced itself. Friendship remained buried inside the memories of aging Italians. This is perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the entire case. The witnesses never became evangelists. They never built a movement. They never founded a religion. They simply grew old. Then, decades later, as they entered their 70s and 80s, some began asking themselves a difficult question. What happens when the last witness dies? Bruno Sammarticchia eventually answered that question by entrusting much of his story to Stefano Breccia. Others slowly followed. The details varied from person to person, but the underlying message remained remarkably consistent. They had kept their promise. They had protected the secret for almost 50 years. Humanity had entered a new millennium. Perhaps it was finally time to tell the story. Yet even after all these decades, one mystery remains unresolved. Nobody ever proved friendship ended. The participants only proved that their involvement ended. Those are two very different things. Because if the W56 truly preferred anonymity, if their entire philosophy revolved around patience, and if their preferred method was to quietly identify trustworthy individuals rather than announce themselves publicly, then there is an unsettling possibility that none of the original participants could ever rule out. Perhaps the old Italians were not the first generation. Perhaps they were simply one generation. And somewhere tonight, in a cafe along the Adriatic coast, an ordinary person may still be having an unusual conversation with an exceptionally calm stranger wearing a simple sweater and polished shoes, completely unaware that they are being offered the same invitation that Bruno Sammartino allegedly received 70 years ago. An invitation that was never supposed to become public. An invitation that did not promise wealth, power, or fame. Only friendship.